All right, so we were looking at moral argument for the existence of God. Last week, we got through three arguments for the existence of God, and you remember, by way of introduction, we talked about what arguments are, how they function, what validity is for an argument. Validity is the structure of the argument, and then if an argument is sound, that means all the premises true within a valid structure. And then we looked at the argument from contingency, or the contingency argument. If everything in the universe is contingent on everything else in the universe for its existence, why is there something rather than nothing? That's a really, really good question. Like, if everything in the universe relies on everything else in the universe, then the universe shouldn't exist. Everything's contingent. So you need a necessary being to set all the contingent things in place and in motion. That would be God. The next one was cosmological argument. That one was really simple. All it does is it's a really straightforward way to show got to be a cause for the universe, and it can't be the universe. That's key. So it's like everything that begins to exist has a cause. Almost, I mean, there are people that argue with that premise, but pretty straightforward. Someone who's not hasn't taken a lot of time to think about that, they'll be like, yeah. And then you go, the universe began to exist. That has a lot of not only rational but scientific evidence to back up that premise that it's true. Well, those two statements are true, then the conclusion of then the universe has a cause makes sense. Just follows naturally from those two premises. Well, if that's the case, and the universe can't be its own cause, it has to be something outside of the universe to cause. What would that be? You can talk about that. It's a pretty good way to. I mean, there's two steps in there, and you're there. In that conversation, the third one was the teleological argument. That one was an argument from the initial conditions of the universe being so finely tuned to permit life that it had to have been done by an intelligent designer. As like, there's no other reasonable explanation. There are other explanations, but they are very unreasonable. And what we're looking for is something that is reasonable. And God as an explanation is reasonable. Now, to someone who is, a staunch empiricist, that's unreasonable because you can't taste and touch and smell God. God, he's not there. Okay, just like lots of things that you can't test scientifically that we accept on rational basis. The laws of logic. Can't touch, taste, prod. Can't do any of those things to the laws of logic. But if you're going to do any kind of rational thinking, if you're going to make any kind of argument, you have to accept them. They are discovered. They're not invented. Interesting fact about them. Numbers, which scientists use models and all that kind of stuff, but numbers in themselves, abstract entities like numbers in math, they have a different kind of existence, something that is tangible, touchable, testable, that kind of thing. Yet you have to accept it if you're going to do your tangible, touchable science. Yeah, it's foundational for it. Like, so there are lots of things that someone who is, all science and nothing else, that they accept. Lots of things that they accept for unscientific reasons. Science is the only way we can know anything. That's unreasonable. There are lots of things that we accept not for scientific reasons. Morality is a really good one. Science can tell you nothing about what is good. It can tell you can do a survey and learn what a group of people thinks is good. You have a number of people. But what is good? What defines that? Why do we think, what is justice? Is punishment for something that you did wrong, is that just? What's fairness? What's the standard for these things? Now, science might be able to inform certain external things about the things that you do that we would call moral or immoral. They can't tell you what is moral or immoral or what you should do. They can only tell you what is. Science can look at the world and tell you what is in the world. And that's great. We can learn a lot, and we can use technology that makes our lives a lot easier, and it's always a cost. But anyways, you can do a lot with science. Science can't help you with this, especially with the grounding for objective moral values and duties in the world. So I kind of touched on this last time. I want to touch on it again. What this argument is talking about is the grounding for morality, grounding for objective morals and duties in the world. So values are the things that we appeal to when we say something is wrong, and then duties are what we tell people they ought to do or ought not to do. You are obligated to, and there's weight to that statement. Like, oh, I did X, I should have done Y in this situation. I was wrong when I did X. Should have done Y. Y is this almost like this other world that doesn't exist because you did X. But this is what you really should have done. So the question on the slide says, can you be good without God? Not, can you do something that is good without God? Anybody can do that. And that's a misunderstanding of the argument. Like, oh, you're saying that atheists can't do good things? Can't do moral actions without God? That's ridiculous. I just saved a cat out of a tree. I'm a good person. That's not what the argument is about. That's a wholly different set of issues. What we're talking about is, what is the grounding for moral values and duties, objective moral values. Well, there's no such thing. Yes, yeah. So any definition of good is not actually a definition, because if it's not an objective moral value, then when I say, let's say, I'm not even going to have an example to give. Taking care of your children, like caring for your children is good, and you ought to do that as a father. Right? You have a moral duty in this world to take care of your children, and that is, and it's an objective moral duty. Right? That's a good thing that you ought to do. Now, if there's no foundation for that word good, if I say that's good, but good doesn't actually refer to anything in reality, then it's meaningless. It doesn't matter. Anything can be good, because good doesn't actually have any content. This is kind of the distinction that I want to talk about in both my hands. So, I do with my hands. All right. All right. So this is I'll use an example from our normal sense experience and how we experience the world, and then use that as how we should understand objective moral values. So, is there an objective reality that you interact with? Is this objectively real? Is the pew that you're sitting on, is that real? Well, how do we know that? Well, because we interact with it with our senses. Right? We walk through the world, we drive our car down the road. The only thing that keeps you on one side of the road, another car on another side of the road without hitting, are lines. That always blows my mind when I think about it. Anyways, just a line on the road. But we intuitively know that there's an objective world, and we interact with it. right? Now you have language that describes the objective world. There is water on the ground in the parking lot because it rained last night. That's a statement about objective reality. Now, if that statement corresponds with the objective reality, I look outside and go, yeah, there's a puddle right over there by the fence, then that statement is true. And it's only true insofar as it corresponds with the objective reality. Now let's look at moral statements. Torturing babies for fun, wrong. Okay, that word wrong or evil or bad in a moral sense, that actually touched down into the objective world, the objective reality. Does it have a reference point? Not one that you can see, but it's real. And we use this language all the time. When someone cuts you off, like, and they almost cause you to crash. That happened. I was driving to work Monday week. I was turning off of, Braga, turning on to Northern Lights, taking that right turn. I was not in the far right lane, but in the one next to it. So I was taking the wide right turn, and this guy with a boat, he's heading down to Whittier or wherever. He shouldn't have been in that lane. He should have been in my lane, but he wasn't. So he's got this giant truck and a huge boat behind it. He goes to take that right turn. Well, he's got to swing it wide. Pushes me onto the onto the little median thing, and I have to slam on my brakes, and then he keeps going, and I get run off the road. Nothing wrong with that. That's just one of the things that happens in this world. And that's all. I can tell you that it happened. I can give you the physics of what was happening. But was it wrong? No, because wrong, good, evil, those don't actually exist. Can't poke it, can't test it. Science doesn't tell us anything about it, so it can't be real. Nobody behaves that way, ever. That's a problem. So, without God, there is no basis for objective good or bad, right or wrong. Everything just becomes preference and opinion. Every moral statement is just, boo, hiss that driver that ran me off the road. That's all. I can get super worked up and angry, but it's just me getting super worked up and angry. It's not actually wrong. Nothing wrong about it. So here's the argument. And I hope you see that there's a difference between, there's an objective moral values and duties that exist. That's what this argument tries to establish. And now we can actually have our statements about moral truths make sense because there's this objective moral reality that it refers to. And then there's this whole other question that's moral ontology. That's what exists. There is this moral sphere or moral fabric in our universe as we interact with it. And so our statements about moral truths actually correspond with something. And then there's, how do we know those things? That's moral epistemology. Now, most of the atheistic arguments against this argument will try to use an epistemological approach, and it has nothing to do with what this argument is trying to establish. That might have just sounded like word salad. It's okay, let's just go through the argument. So if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Pretty straightforward. If there's no grounding for it, then they don't exist. However, objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, the inverse is true. God exists. Pretty straightforward argument. So, without an objective reference point, there's no way to determine up from down. God's nature is that objective reference point for moral values. It is the standard by which all moral actions are measured. Without this reference point, all we are left with is a subjective reference point, our preferences, not valid or binding for anyone else. God has expressed his moral nature in moral commands, providing a basis for moral duties. So, God says you ought to love your neighbor as yourself, or do as you would be done by. That's a command. And that provides a basis for moral duties, what you ought to do. God's nature of love is expressed in the command to love your neighbor as yourself. This command provides the foundation for an objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality, as well as the objective evil of greed, abuse, and discrimination. The more closely a moral action corresponds with God's nature, the better it is. And if there's no God, who or what lays moral duties on us? Why should I take care of my children? I don't want to. If it's inconvenient for me right now, why should I? Like, well, you have a duty to do that. They're your children. But right now, it's a bad time. Like, is there ever a good time? Like, it's sometimes like, might think, but think about that, right? So you need God to establish these objective morals and duties. But what is the other worldview? What's the other worldview look like? Well, humans are just highly evolved animals. That's all. Animals do not have any moral obligations to one another. Think about that. A cat may catch and kill a mouse, but it does not murder that mouse. There's a difference there. The male great white shark may forcibly copulate with a female shark, but it does not rape a female shark. There's a difference. The animal has not done anything morally wrong. The cat is just being a cat. It's part of its nature. Catch and kill mice or spiders or whatever it wants to chase and bat around with little paws and look cute. Or you might think, cats. Either way, that is just its nature. Same with the shark. The shark is just being a shark. You can't bring it to court, accuse it of something that it's done morally wrong, and hold it accountable for something that it's done morally wrong. It's just an animal. That's just its nature. Well, if humans are only highly evolved animals, then anything we do is just what's within our nature to do. Like, grab some guns and go kill some kids in a school. That's just something humans do. There's nothing wrong about it because there's no objective moral reality. Just next greatest thing that evolved on the scene. That's all. That should, you should be screaming, that's not okay. Whoa, that's not right. That can't be right. Our experience screams against that, and it should. See what I did there? But if there's no, and no, that doesn't make any sense. So, likewise, on a naturalistic evolutionary view of the world, human behavior should be understood in the same way. No action should be considered right or wrong. When a human kills another human, it's just a human being being a human. That's all. Just like a cat is being a cat, batting around a mouse. The problem is good and bad, right and wrong do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, so our moral experience convinces us that values are objectively real. Anytime you say, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice, you affirm your belief in objective values. Like, cool, if you want to say God isn't real, then you have to throw away all the basis for any morality. But then if you, in the same, in the next breath, want to be like, and I want to fight for justice. I'm for social justice, or I'm for this is wrong and we should stand against it. Why? Who cares? Convince me. Like, well, it's all power, and these people have had the power for so many years, and we need to overthrow them and give power to these oppressed people. Like, well, what if I'm a part of this oppressor class and I kind of like power? And that's why I oppress these people. I don't want them to have power. Well, that's wrong. Ha! Wrong. Whatever. Child abuse, racial discrimination, and terrorism are wrong. All the time, for all people. Is this just a personal preference or an opinion? Your emphatic answer should be no. This is real. When I say that's wrong, it actually corresponds with reality. It's wrong. It ought not to be done. Atheism fails to give a plausible account of the moral reality that everyone experiences every single day. And this is what points to a great inconsistency in our secular society today. Secular people agree with the first premise. God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Like, cool. I don't think he exists. Doesn't matter. So they claim that there are no objective moral values. The best we can do is relativism, right? So let's say our society is our relative sphere. And we make rules, that govern our lives. That's our morality. Consequence of that belief is that they're terrified to impose their values on others. Because it's just relative to us. We can't judge some other country with a different set of moral relative to themselves, different moral duties and values. Can't judge them. What happens when your society fragments down to smaller and smaller populations within your own society that have vastly different moral values to each other? Well, then you fundamentalist Christians are just bigots because your moral values don't align with mine. But my highest value is tolerance. Except for you bigots. Yeah. Except for that. I tolerate everything except for tolerance. See how ridiculous that is? How self-refuting that is. But the more the society fragments into smaller and smaller groups, into identity groups, then that becomes the new relative center for your moral values. Well, then you're going to have conflict all the time. But if there's no basis at all for any moral values, then it's just a whole lot of hot air about nothing. It's crazy. So, on the one hand, they say, yeah, there's no objective moral values, yet at the same time, they hold certain values very tightly and think it's objectively wrong to impose your values on others. Can't have it both ways. So, premise 2 ends up, by their own experience, being true. And if both premises are true, and this is a syllogism, there's only 2 steps, then the conclusion necessarily follows. Therefore, God must. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having these arguments. We would just be like, that's what that guy did. Just what a human being does. That's all. The importance of this argument is that it gives us a moral creator. Right? So the 3 previous arguments, it just talks about a creator, basically. The contingency argument, must be super powerful if he created all of these contingent things and put them in relation to each other where they can help each other exist. The whole universe is one giant contingent system, right? It's like a giant ecosystem. That's the contingency argument. Then you have the cosmological argument. That's kind of the cause argument. It goes all the way back to the very beginning. Okay, well, there's got to be a cause for the whole universe. Who's that? It's God. Whoa, this must be a super powerful, like very powerful God, the cause of this. And he has necessary existence and not contingent existence. Then you have the teleological argument. This God is super brilliant. He finely tuned all of these initial conditions for the universe to exist to permit life. And then there's a bunch of things within that life that if they weren't exactly specifically that way, they wouldn't exist. Wow, this God is super smart. Where's morality come in? Right here. You can talk about a creator all day, but if that creator isn't moral, we're not really getting down to the essence of what it means to be a human being. This moral sphere is really where it gets down to what it means to be a human. All right, argument 5. This one's weird. The ontological argument. I've used this word ontology, ontological, ontos, multiple times. This is just, ontos means being or what exists. This is the argument from existence. So, the very possibility of God's existence implies that God exists, which many atheistic philosophers go, that can't be right. Right? I mean, think about it. It's like, even if it's possible that God exists, then he does. Like, how did you get there? Like, there's got to be a step in the middle that you skipped over that, what's going on here? It first originated with St. Anselm in 1078. He had this idea of a most perfect being. So what all... Yeah, here's the argument. And then, Alvin Plantinga is a definitely more recent philosopher who took up... Anselm was his argument was done away with by Kant. I think it was Kant. I can't remember. Anyways, there was a philosopher who came along much further, and what he said was existence can't be a predicate. So it's like you have this argument that's like, oh, if you have the most perfect being would have perfect qualities, like omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresent, all of these perfect qualities. And we go, yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, cool. Well, if you had the idea in your head of the most perfect being, and then you had the actual most perfect being in reality, which one would be better? The one in reality. Or which one would be, more perfect? The one that exists in reality. Well, then he exists. Because if you can think of a most perfect being, but that most perfect being would be more perfect if he existed in reality, then he's not the most perfect being. In order to be the most perfect being, it's got to exist in reality, therefore God exists. Right. So even the very possibility implies God's existence. That was like, so the predicate is, okay, therefore God exists. Like, well, he either existed before you started describing him or he didn't. That can't be a predicate. That was the criticism. Well, Alvin Plantinga does this. All right, this is the argument. There's a lot of steps, but hopefully it makes sense. It's possible. So notice, this isn't like absolute certainty. This is the way it is. It's like just possible. It is possible that a maximally great being exists. Think anybody would argue with that? Just the possibility. It seems pretty neutral. At least possible. I think everybody would agree with that premise. Premise 2. A maximally great being exists in some possible world. So in all the possible worlds that could exist, in at least one of them, a maximally great being exists. If a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. So just like imagine downstairs, a bunch of doors, right, that go to different rooms. Those are your possible worlds. It's possible that a maximally great being exists in one of those. Well, if he's going to be maximally great, if he exists in one of them, then he's got to exist in all of them. If he's going to be maximally great. If a maximally great being exists, this is premise 4, in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world, because the actual world is one of those possible worlds. A maximally great being exists in the actual world, therefore, a maximally great being exists, and that's God. There you go. Yeah, it just follows. Yeah. So, you might object to premise 1. The atheist has to demonstrate, if you're going to object to premise 1, the atheist has to demonstrate that the idea of a maximally great being is logically incoherent. So then you'd have to pick apart, what do you mean by maximally great being? Well, I mean like omnipotent, all the omnis, right? Omniscient, omnipotent, all of those. It's like omnibenevolent, so all good. And then the atheist would have to demonstrate how all of those qualities fitting together is somehow logically incoherent. It doesn't actually fit together, which is difficult to do. And by logically incoherent, it means there's something wrong definitionally. So if I said, yeah, my twin brother is a married bachelor. Like, sorry, you didn't actually say anything. To be married means you're no longer a bachelor. So if you're a married bachelor, that's logically incoherent. Those don't fit together. Or a square circle. Can't have a square circle. The definition of a square and the definition of a circle cannot be merged together. They're logically incoherent if you try and smash them together. You might put those words next to each other in a statement, but you're not actually saying anything because it's incoherent. You'd have to demonstrate, the atheist would have to demonstrate that something about the definition of a maximally great being is like that, logically incoherent. But being able to make such a demonstration seems highly implausible. So, if you leave open that first premise, the rest of it follows quite nicely. And if you're sharing, like, this is the most kind of esoteric of the arguments, but with the other 4 behind it, it's like that makes sense. But if you're sharing this one, then just leave that first premise as an open question to whoever you're talking to. Like, is it possible that that God exists? That a maximally great being exists? Who on that? Is it even possible? Because if it is, then he does. But if it's not possible, then you're probably going to have to use other arguments to be a bit more persuasive as to whether it's possible. Like, well, is it possible? Well, I mean, it seems like we need a cause for this whole. Seems reasonable to me. So, just leave that as an open question. Here's some things to think about. Practical suggestions. If an unbeliever says something like, there's no evidence for the existence of God, I don't know if you've ever had a conversation like that. They're just like, you keep talking about God, that's great, but I don't see any evidence. Just look at them with wide eyes and be like, man, I can think of 5 reasons. There's really good reasons for why God exists. And then all you have to is just list. If you say, I can think of 5 reasons, unless they really don't want a conversation, they'll go, what are those 5? Or what do you mean? And all you have to do is just list them. Be like, look, God makes sense of why anything exists at all. God makes sense of the origin of the universe. That's the cosmological argument. God makes sense of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. Teleological argument. God makes sense of the objective moral values and duties in the world. The moral argument. The very possibility of God's existence implies God exists. And you just say those, and there's so much, there's just so much that's going on with that. Like, be really interesting. Because it can just go almost anywhere. You can just pick one of those. Or usually, they've probably, and we do this too, so this is not a disparaging comment in general, but someone who says, well, there's just no evidence, they've probably heard someone else say that, and they sounded really smart when they said it. And no one challenged them. So when you go, well, here are 5 reasons why I think it's actually reasonable to think that God exists. Boom, 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 boom. 5. They're probably not prepared for that because they just watched a YouTube video and they saw someone really popular say something. And they thought, yeah, I can shut somebody down by just saying this. And then when you actually challenge them, oh, now I have to think about this. And then it could just end right there. It's like, these are the 5 reasons. I mean, if you want me, I can go into more detail. But the conversation can end there. That's fine. But maybe later they'll be like, so what do you mean that God makes sense of why anything exists at all? What do you mean by that? Like, everything exists. What's like, why? What's the explanation for that? And just, and then you can give them the premises. And here's the thing about getting into a debate and argumentation. Stick to your premises. Stick to, okay, here is the argument, here are the premises. Which one do you disagree with? Not, wow, and they just make something up that has nothing to do with what the actual argument says. Like, whoa, pick one of the premises and tell me which one you disagree with. Because I've laid this out in what I think is a coherent way that you can understand. Now, please tell me where I might be, let's just be like, I could be wrong. Maybe I'm totally mistaken on this. And like, I need to clear up one of these premises because I'm holding an untruth. And I don't want that. And you kind of leave it open like that. And it gives them some time, a little bit of room to breathe, to be like, oh, well, I think this one's wrong. And you can talk about that one. Be like, okay, well, here's my defense of this premise. I think it still follows. And then usually it'll come around to, well, that God of the Bible, he's for slavery, he's for genocide, and eventually it'll get to something like that. It's like, I didn't make any argument like that. These are why I think it's reasonable to believe that God exists. Now, I can tell you why I think the Bible is God's word. That's a completely different conversation, though. But if you're dealing with someone who doesn't even think that God exists or that's even possible that God exists, which we know from Scripture, well, suppressing that truth, right? They're trying to hold it down, they're holding it down in their unrighteousness. We're trying to guide them out of that, where it's like, hey, I think this actually makes more sense. And then pray that God shows them the light of his word. They have understanding. But it's like, we're trying to clear the weeds out of the way. That way they can have a straight shoot. God. If they want more information, just give them the premises. Stay focused on the premises. And then you can say something like, if you think my conclusions are false, then you think one of my premises is false. And which one of those do you think is false? Few theists would rest their case for God on any one argument. Well, there's 5. And these are the 5 that William Lane Craig got it from him. But each argument seems to demonstrate a different attribute of God along with his existence. So, for example, the cosmological argument shows that God is infinitely powerful. The teleological argument reveals that he is intelligent. Moral argument demonstrates that he's moral. And that if he exists, the ontological argument shows that he's a necessary being and must exist. Like, all of those taken together are a lot of really good reasons to believe that God exists. Now, you haven't necessarily gotten from God of these arguments to the God of Scripture. You gotta make that connection. But dealing with someone who just doesn't even recognize that there are good reasons to think that it's even possible that God exists. These are really good reasons. And then you can get into, and there's a God in Scripture that fits this, but is also more. Let me tell you about him. He loves you so much that he came and died for you. That's who I want to talk about. I kind of need to get you there. And there's some teachers that would say that this is all like these arguments and all that stuff. You don't really need it. Just preach the gospel. And I go, well, yes, preach the gospel. But there's been just from my practical experience, there's been too many conversations that I've had where something like one of these arguments has really clicked with somebody and it made them think, oh, there's this whole area that I haven't even considered. And it was because I was able to kind of clear the weeds away. And then it opens it up a little bit for the gospel to actually land. What I think this does is it changes the soil of the heart, or it can help. It's super hard, then maybe some of these arguments can soften it up a little bit. Seed will land in a little bit better soil, and maybe. And I think that's the purpose, or at least that's what I see as the purpose, sharing these arguments. God exists, but people don't want to believe it. I'll suppress that truth. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, thank you so much for this morning. Thank you for this lesson. I pray it's been an encouragement and a challenge to everybody that's here. Lord, I pray that as we move forward in this service, Lord, that you'd give me the words to speak. Lord, I pray for wisdom and guidance, for clarity. I pray, Lord, that you'd accept our worship. Lord, I pray you accept my preaching as worship to you, and I pray that you'd accept our singing and our fellowship together as worship to you. Lord, thank you so much for all that you've done for us. Dying on a cross for our sins, make us holy. Pray that we would rejoice in that, continue to follow you in that sanctification process. Amen. Any questions or anything that just popped in your head, or